And 6 days later on my desk lands a report from UNICEF, the World Children's Organization, and they are saying that I am a war criminal because I prosecute minors. Palestinian minors, lo aleinu, we have to deal with people like Murad Dais. I apologize for the graphic description that I'm about to give, but we have to deal with people like this. Murad Dais gets up in the morning, he watches Palestinian television, he hears the incitement, he goes outside, he walks into the neighboring settlement, and there he murders really one of these angels walking among us, Daphne Meir. This is, I apologize for the graphics, but he stabs her repeatedly in front of her children until the knife gets stuck into her skull and he can no longer bring it out. And I am a war criminal because I am prosecuting this low-life terrorist. That's UNICEF's opinion. I started a process, thank God, with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and within the army to launch this dialogue with UNICEF. It was sadly a complete failure. They retracted some of their report, but not all of it, and I remain a war criminal to this day. My involvement, as I say to everyone, with everything to do with the ICC and the ICJ is more because of the fact that I'm trying to prepare my own defense rather than anything else. And with that story, we'll launch into our panel, really a panel of experts, if I may say, everyone talking about something a little bit different in the constraints of our time. We're going to start with Professor Eugene Kontorovich. Eugene, start us off, please. Tell us why I'm not a war criminal and why Israel is a legitimate state and really why I don't have anything to worry about.
Okay, thank you. It's puzzling to be here on this 30th anniversary because I remember very distinctly where I was 30 years ago when on the news of this deal that was cooked in Oslo was suddenly announced on an unsuspecting country. I was sitting with my good friend Uri Dan in his living room. The news came on, and you'd think we'd be upset, we'd be shocked. We just kind of laughed. We said, some kind of funny stunt. It can't be serious. It's never going to work. It's not going to go anywhere. And yet it's created a fundamental intellectual paradigm which even after the fundamentals of Oslo have collapsed, even when faith in Oslo has collapsed, remains with us to this day. And I want to address that from the perspective of international law. You don't hear Israel commonly defending its claim to sovereignty in Jerusalem, in Judea and Samaria, through the framework of international law. And I think this is partly a function of the Oslo Accords. In the 1970s and 80s, Israeli diplomats and lawyers, like Yehuda Blum and others, made the case that Israel has sovereign rights under international law. This was clearly the view of the Israeli government, which can be most clearly seen from the no-fuss, matter-of-fact way in which Israel extended full Israeli law, civil law, to Jerusalem, to municipal Jerusalem, as well as surrounding villages in what Jordan called the West Bank, incorporating both all of municipal Jerusalem and surrounding villages into Israeli law, was a matter-of-fact thing, a matter of clear sovereign right. But Oslo changed the framework, because if you're planning on giving something away, it doesn't help your countrymen to talk about your sovereign rights to it. Right? The Israelis understood something deep in psychology. It's called the endowment effect, that if you say something it's yours, it's harder to give it away. And we saw, it's not that the government ever said it's not ours, but they stopped feeling they need to explain. The Palestinians also understood the endowment effect. They understood that if they say it's all ours, it will become easy for them to say, well, now we can't compromise because the Palestinian street won't accept it. They've been told it's all ours. And so in the narrative of the foreign ministry, these arguments have been lost, and I think it's time to be recovered. They are unvarnished by time. They have never been abandoned. And the very simple version of this argument deals with, you have to say, what is the general rule for the borders of countries? Don't think anything about Israel. Don't think about 1947 or 1948, 1949. First you have to know, when a country is created, how do you find out its borders? And countries are created often enough that there's actually a uniform, clear rule in international law to deal with that. And that rule is very simple. It says when a new country is created, because of the collapse of an empire, federal dissolution, divorce, like in the Czech case, for whatever reason, the new country has the borders of the top-level administrative unit in the new territory. You can try this with your favorite new country, try this anywhere. Take Crimea, for example, as Vladimir Putin did in 2014. The world believes that Crimea belongs rightfully to Ukraine. Is it because of the principle we hear so much about involved in the Israeli case, self-determination, i.e. Palestinian self-determination? Ukraine's self-determination claim is pretty weak. Most of the people there were ethnic Russians. Most would probably prefer to be part of Russia, not like 90% like they said in their election. That's just the only number that comes out of Russian ballot machines. But the majority, right? Historically part of Russia, linguistically part of Russia. But despite all that, right, this Russian group that wants to be part of, here we're told if there's an ethnic minority in part of a country, they need to go with whoever language they speak or whatever ethnicity they're part of. They can't be a minority in a country they don't want to be a minority in. But the Russians, the Crimean Russians, yes, they should be a minority in Ukraine. Why? Because those were the borders of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic at the moment of the collapse of the Soviet Union and Ukrainian independence. Those borders were not drawn in a way with concern of anyone's self-determination. They were drawn kind of arbitrarily by Nikita Khrushchev for his own political ideas. But those are the borders you're stuck with. Why? Because any contrary rule would mean every time a new country is created, there's going to be infinite contestation over all its borders based on the highly indeterminate principles of fairness, demography, history, and ancient right. This is the rule around the world. For example, the Azerbaijanis are about to roll over an ethnic Armenian enclave called Nagorno-Karabakh. People there are 100% Armenian, and they 100% don't want to be part of Azerbaijan. Nobody's saying they have a right of self-determination that lets them opt out. Why? Because it was within the borders of the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic at the time of its independence. End of discussion. Let's apply that to our situation. What were the borders at the time of Israel independence? They were very clear, undisputed. If you asked anyone in, let's say, March 1948, what is the top level, what's the government here, what's the entity? Mandate of Palestine, mandatory Palestine. And its borders were very clear, and there was no West Bank in it, or Gaza. Those were the presumptive de facto borders of Israel at the moment of its independence, and the borders it would enjoy unless it explicitly waives or disclaims them, which it has not done in the case of Judea and Samaria. This is the rule applied universally around the world. It also explains why the international community did not accept Jordan's claim of annexation of the West Bank, which would be inexplicable otherwise, right? If it didn't belong to anyone, why not? This remains the basis for Israel's claim. Now let's look at the contrary claim. The contrary claim, essentially, is that Jordan's war of aggression against Israel, which sought to meet with the Egyptians, Molotov-Ribbentrop, divide them in the middle, but was partially successful. That as far as Jordan got in its plan to conquer and ethnically cleanse the Jewish state, the borders of the Jordanian ethnic cleansing of the Jewish people should be permanent, should be etched into international law to create the world's only international law, no Jew zone, for all time. That's an extraordinarily illiberal proposition, which we should feel comfortable talking about in all of its illiberality, which is why the other side has to say Article 49.6, settler, deportation, transfer, something obscure. To say they're trying to say where the Jordan ethnically cleansed Jews from. For sure, they're never going to live under an Arab state. That's obvious. You don't need international law for that. And also, we're going to say it's internationally illegal for them to live there if it falls temporarily under the power of a Jewish state. These arguments need to be addressed head on. Oslo was like a kind of drug, a steroid, in which Israel began to frame its, say, we're going to just discuss it as our legitimacy here as an internal thing within Oslo. It's under negotiation, right? Someone comes to ask you, like, what's the deal with your house? Under escrow, right? So the escrow's not going through. And it's time now to vest these arguments on the firm international legal ground on which they have.
Amazing, Eugene.
Also 8 minutes.
At least now I feel a little bit safer in the fact that I'm not going to be arrested immediately. Unfortunately, we have Greg. Greg's going to explain to us how, whilst you so eloquently explained that there is and cannot be an idea of this state of Palestine, the ICC seems to believe that it exists. Not only does it exist, that it has borders, and that those borders have been set by the court. And that's going to be also the discussion of the ICJ very, very soon. Where do we stand, Greg? What's going to be with the ICC? What's going to be with the ICJ? How soon is Israel going to meet that, really, the reality of this brick wall of inventing something which doesn't exist, and then really punishing us for that invention?
Thank you, Maurice. I have bad news for you. Because the general trajectory is likely to continue in the direction that it is currently going. Isabella mentioned the Soviet campaign of delegitimization using Israel as a wedge between the USA and the Arab world, and the 1975 racism, Zionism resolution. What we've seen, I think, is the maturing of that delegitimization into criminalization. And that's partly a product of the end of the Cold War and a unipolar world under the notion of rule of law and the creation of new tribunals, the Arbitral Tribunal for the WTO, the new International Criminal Tribunals, and the International Criminal Court. So we're in a lawyerized world, and one in which we look at global legalism, and delegitimization propaganda matures into criminalization. And that's largely driven by UN resolutions across the General Assembly and Security Council and other bodies, which are driven by the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, which on its website says that it is the largest international organization in the world after the UN, and that it was established with its raison d'etre as the Palestinian cause. So discourse on Israel is dominated by alliances with the OIC, and that tends to move into the sphere of UN courts. And when I say UN courts, I mean the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, but there's a whole plethora of courts that are part of the UN family, and it's not a bad idea to think of them as UN courts because they defer to UN resolutions when drawing their jurisprudence. For example, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, in 2004, gave no interpretive explanation other than one sentence in paragraph 120 that relied on UN resolutions to determine that the transfer of civilians into Judea and Samaria was illegal under Article 49 of the Geneva Conventions because UN resolutions and the Security Council had supposedly said so. And in its 2023 advisory opinion concerning legal consequences for Israeli actions suppressing Palestinian self-determination. All the documents that are up there now, there are several folios, about 8. We're talking about volumes of documents from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and various other agencies, the new report that's just come out from the Committee on Inalienable Rights of Palestinian People and so on. These are what are going to be used as the fact-finding sources for the court. So the court's going to rely on agencies which are political agencies and on the resolutions of bodies which are political bodies in order to draw its jurisprudence. And that involves then diminished reference to, in fact, the subordination of what we traditionally think of as international law principles drawn from treaties, conventions, customary international law, which are then subordinated to UN resolutions. The International Criminal Court follows the same pattern. when it handed down its decision on the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination as determined in UN resolutions as evidence for its own jurisdiction in answer to a question posed to it by the prosecutor whether there was jurisdiction. So it was a very circular approach. And circular reasoning affirms UN political resolutions as legal rules for the judiciary. And international jurisprudence is well suited to that sort of manipulation because there's a lack of hierarchy in a fragmented system. The rules are imprecise. Courts have final authority without any wider accountability of any substance. And there are few jurisprudential doctrines. So, for example, the American doctrine of the political question, which a court won't address, is one that the International Court of Justice has rejected as a limit on its power. And in particular, advisory opinions, where you're not dealing with a dispute between parties limited to the terms of the dispute between them, provide great scope for creative activity by judges. And judges are parts of courts which are really international corporate bodies which want to do business. They're actually competing with each other for cases. And Justice James Crawford, who was an Australian justice on the court, described the 1966 decision on Southwest Africa, where the court decided it had no jurisdiction, as a public relations disaster. And it's well known that there were lean years where nobody brought cases to the court after that because it had lost the confidence of the majority of UN countries who are developing countries. Over 165 of the 194 UN members are developing countries. And it changed its policy in 1971 in an advisory opinion, again on Namibia. The court reversed position and business tended to pick up, and it's now booming. There were 3 referrals to the court in June this year. And so reference to UN resolutions is good for business. It maintains the legal rhetoric of legitimacy. It maintains the business of the courts. It maintains the roles of the judges. And so where does that take us to in terms of the Oslo Accords? When we look at legal doctrine concerning treaties, Oslo obligations, doctrines of succession, such as Eugene was referring to, the international law favours Israel. So we tend to argue that law. But the opposition argues UN resolutions, and the UN resolutions overwhelmingly favour the Palestinians, and judges have indicated that they will go with the UN resolutions. And ironically then, the Palestinian anti-Israel advocacy disengages from Oslo, and we're fighting, I think, a losing battle there because you have the engagement of judges, advocates, UN agencies, legal academics, a plethora of law NGOs, and Israel's legal defense is about 30 years, a whole generation plus behind. But is Oslo worth defending? Maybe one way to think about it is what comes after Oslo. What do we want to be advocating as the succeeding legal regime, given the failure of Oslo? And in relation to recent work I've been doing in Australia, where the government recently decided that it was going to use the terminology occupied Palestinian territories and illegal settlements, and I was trying to get blog posts published, I realised it's a losing game. It's a mug's game to always be playing defence, because you can't win if you're only defending. You have to go into attack. And so a better legal strategy is to move into attack breaches of Oslo, to attack legally terror activities, terror sponsors, the sorts of things that we know panellists here today are doing, but which we need to do much better.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you, Greg. Really, as you said, it's not particularly looking particularly good for myself, but it's okay. And really, what Greg said, and really is, as we know, is an integral part of this process, is all the anti-Israel NGO work and the cooperation between the NGOs and the UN mechanisms. As we know, UN organizations request, pay for, fund, reports from NGOs. They then publish them, and then they adopt them, and they become the reality. Give us a little bit of an insight into the idea of Durban, the NGO movements, and how we found ourselves in a situation where we're being attacked on every single level, and basically on a house of cards with no background, no basis.
Thanks, Maurice. First, also, I just want to give a shout out to Professor Gerald Steinberg, our founder and president, who is really one of the first people that drew attention to all of the issues that we're speaking to today, and has tirelessly been working, to stop these things for more than 20 years. So, just want to acknowledge him. With the things that Greg and Eugene were speaking about could not have taken place without the NGO industry. And this NGO industry developed as a result of Oslo, and primarily because of the role of the Europeans and the European Union. So because the Europeans felt a little bit left out of the Oslo process, they decided to exercise their influence via NGO funding and began pumping in tens of millions of euros, kroner, francs, every year into this group of organizations that has tremendous influence today, and I'll just briefly mention some of the ways in which they have that influence. When Greg was talking about the reports and resolutions that make up the dossier of the ICJ advisory opinion, if you dig into the details of those reports, they are almost all based on NGO claims and reports. When you look at the ICJ question itself, this originated from the NGOs beginning in 2007. So in 2007, a UN rapporteur, John Dugard, who was very involved with this group of organizations, first posed the question of the ICJ opinion that is under consideration right now. It was further amplified by a group of NGOs in 2009, Israeli NGO activists, Palestinian NGOs, some international NGOs. And then in 2013 in Ramallah, there was a conference at Birzeit University with PA officials, UN officials, European officials, and the same group of NGOs that are getting tens of millions of euros each year. And the wording of the question that is before the ICJ is almost identical to what was proposed at this strategy conference at Birzeit University in 2013. And in addition, at that conference, what else was proposed? The PA joining the ICC, and also the PA bringing a complaint against Israel at the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And let us not forget that that is also something pending right now, and I expect around the time of the ICJ opinion, it should be coming any moment, there will be another UN finding calling us apartheid and all these other horrible things in order to feed into the ICJ opinion. So this is all a feature of the UN lobbying, the NGO lobbying at the UN and European parliaments, all the reporting they put out. And what's very curious is really from day one, well, beginning in Durban, let's say, that we can look at the UN World Conference Against Racism in 2001 was really the beginning when these political warfare campaigns really shifted from states primarily to NGOs taking up that mantle. So at Durban, we begin to see the lawfare strategy, kind of the skeleton outline of that, applying the apartheid strategy that was used in South Africa. The BDS campaign originated at the 2001 Durban conference. And some of these early calls to have an ICC look at Israel. And over the years, this funding has been going to the EU, and European governments were giving this funding ostensibly for human rights, for democracy, for promoting good governance, for building what was going to be a Palestinian state in the Palestinian Authority. And instead, all of that money has been being pumped into these lawfare initiatives. And the other amazing thing about it is when you look at these activities, they seem to contradict with all of the European policies that European governments and the EU claim that they want to be promoting. So the EU is very vocal, to their credit, on anti-Semitism, for instance. They were promoting the IRA definition to combat anti-Semitism. They were the first countries to adopt the definition. They've been actually quite good about producing handbooks and guidance, putting into funding contracts that funding should not be going to organizations promoting anti-Semitism. Yet, when it comes to our region, all of the organizations in the Palestinian Authority, and I'll say others, are getting tens of millions of euros a year and engaging in anti-Semitic activities that contradict the IRA definition. Why is that? The European Union, European governments have very strong counterterrorism policies. Yet, we see them giving, over the past 10, 15 years, have given more than 100 million euros to a network of about 13 NGOs that are closely tied to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And it is also now in the NGO funding contracts with the EU that such organizations should not be getting money. And yet, they are still getting money. The Israeli government apparently is still allowing this money to be given to these organizations, strangely. That's another example. Another example is they promote a two-state policy, yet not one of the NGOs that they are funding under these auspices of human rights and good governance support two states. Not one of them supports Oslo. From day one, they've been undermining Oslo. So I think, and then to try to get the full information, the full scope of this problem is nearly impossible because European governments guard this information as if it's on the level of nuclear secrets. So for instance, we are currently involved in a case in the UK trying to get the name of NGO grantees from 2018 to 2020 for one project, and the names are actually available on the UN's website, so it's actually not even a secret, and the UK government refuses to give it to us under the claim that it's going to embarrass the UK government if these names come out. And we see this across Europe, across the EU. America is a little bit better about it. We see similar problems in Canada, Australia. And so, you know, and I'm sure these problems are not completely unknown to the people in the room. So I think in terms of moving forward, I think we need to continue to hold Europeans accountable to explain these inexplicable policies, why they're doing what they're doing, and also from the Israeli government to demand the Europeans to stop these practices. So I guess I'll end there.
From there, I want to go straight on, right? Not stopping. Fiamma, to you. Can you please try to just explain to us why the Europeans are so anti and really anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian, and why they allow this anti-Semitism to again fester and grow all over Europe to the point where we're getting to the point. Let's not go back historically, but we're getting to an area which is going to be very, very problematic very, very soon.
First of all, let me thank you. Okay, thank you, and thank to Dan, and thank to our institute that has been so courageous and strong to organize this thing, because what we are doing now, we are really discussing one of the main and most important issue in the legitimization of about the legitimization of Israel, something that has moved. Don't you hear me? Can you hear me? So while I was preparing these few minutes of talk, I just sank into the so many pages I've written about that, because I had the adventure of covering the story since the very beginning, before and after and during and whatsoever. And here then I will not go into the paradoxical destruction. I have written many books about it, and the last one is the one which is called Jewish Lives Matter, and it's just about the paradoxical destruction of the religion of our times by the same protagonists that should defend it, the United Nations, the European Union, the NGO, and whatsoever. I mean, because this has been covered very well by the things that you have said until now and the things that will be said now. I just want to go into three short episodes of my life, one each minute, okay? The first one is when I am a very young girl. My parents sent me to Kibbutz Neot Mordechai in the north, and there started the 6 Days War. It is 1967, and I'm there. I will not tell you about all the war. When I come back, this is when I wrote afterwards a long essay that was for commentary when I wrote, and there the title was When I Became an Unconscious Fascist. That was the title of the, I came back, I was, you know, all the youngsters like me were communists at that time, and this is what I was. So I come back from the 6 Days War, and they just picked me up from my high school where I was and throw me out of the school. Here I will stop because that's a long story. Second episode, just on the knees, just in the very days of the Oslo agreements before that, my newspaper, La Stampa, at that time, sent me to Tunis to interview Arafat. So I go there, they put something on my eyes, and I go and meet him in a house in the periphery of Tunis. I ask him a lot of questions, then I try for my scoop. I take out a map of the area, I show it to him and give him a pen, and I ask him, please draw a division where you think that the state of Israel and where the Palestinian state should be. He kicks me again out of the room. That's the second time I've been kicked out of one room, this time from Yasser Arafat, and then I have interviewed several other times. But that was he got very, very angry, started shouting at me. He was living there with the children of Sabra and Shatila, so he repeated that to me several times. When I met him, you can hear. Okay, I'll stop with this story. But this is just to tell you that when I was out of it, you know, exactly as when I became an unconscious fascist, even at that time, I was completely aware of what was the issue about. I know who Arafat was, I knew what he was saying, and of course I was not the only one. I was already somebody that was writing about international affairs and Middle Eastern affairs daily, and I was totally aware of the terrible terrorist attacks that were in that period, Maalot, you know, attacking buses full of children. That's the time where the terrorist attacks were. So I was totally aware of what. Now go to the third episode. Uri Savir calls me on the phone. You remember who Uri Savir was, yes? He was the right arm of Shimon Peres. He calls me and he says, you know, they knew who I was, an unconscious fascist. I was already writing whatever I thought, but Uri Savir calls me because I know I'm from Florence, I'm Italian, I know everybody, and he says, is there a place where we could make a secret meeting in Tuscany? I've written that several times. And myself, even knowing what was going on, this is the point, it didn't pass through my head to say, well, I must think about it, give me a second, I should reflect. I immediately said, yes, of course. I called a gentlewoman by the name of Bona Frescobaldi, a noble woman from Florence. She gave them, I don't know who was there, it was nighttime, I think they were very, very important people that went and met, and this was just among the meetings of Oslo, which I already knew that was something that maybe was not the best thing to happen because Arafat was who he was. So what was, I've been asking myself many times, that pushed me so far to accept immediately the request of Uri Savir, that I knew perfectly who he was because I interviewed him several times. It was the hegemony of the left on the Jewish mind at that time. It was exactly that was the point. The left and the Jewish were intertwined as twins, The left needed the Jews, the Jews needed the left. Why that? The answer is quite clear. The victory, you can hear me? The victory on the right was the victory on the Nazism, on the fascism, yes. The Jews had to say that they had been saved by the liberal, progressive part of the world that kept going in this relationship with the Jews. The Jews, on their side, looking for an ideological raison d'être, had a very strong push, a very strong pull toward the left. And this was also because at the beginning of the Jewish state, our leadership was mainly a left-wing leadership. This is something that we cannot forget when we ask ourselves today the reasons why nobody, even knowing who was Arafat, who the Palestinians were, why did we immediately go after this Piffero of Hamelin, that was the peace? Because peace was something that was rescuing our soul from all the accusation of the left of being nationalist, warmongers, nowadays even a friend and an ally to the imperialist policy of the United States. So it was something that was coming straight. You know, when I think always, and I know that the story is long and I cannot tell it all, but I always think about Vasily Grossman when I think about that moment. Vasily Grossman, that he's the son of somebody that has been killed in Ukraine. He's the son of one of the victims of the war, and he enters there with the Red Army and sees what's happened over there. Where even if he is slowly understand what also the communism is doing to the Jews, still he keeps this relationship so strong that even in that little book where he describes there had already been all the slaughters brought by the communists in Ukraine, not only the Nazi slaughters, also the communist slaughters had already been there. But he cannot tell the story. He can tell also the story. The same with us. For us, the Jews, to break with the left is a wound that we inflict inside our own soul. We can never do it. For us, it's so difficult, so terrible. So when I look at the possibility nowadays to change our mindset, I look at the future where things are changing in their complexity. If you want to know what I think about our issue of today...
Maybe we'll save that for the next time.
Exactly. You can read my books. But this was very important to me, for me to tell you, because otherwise this will not be complete. We must think about ourselves, the Israeli people that I'm part of, proudly so, as somebody that is always under a strong hegemonic effort from the left side of the ideology. And this is something that we have to keep in mind when we want to fight anti-Semitism today, which is my...
So that's really, thank you, Fiamma. Really, that's where we want to carry on from there. With Brooke, with the experience of talking to suicide bombers, potential suicide bombers, and the idea of really co-opting our idea of Israel's right to exist, and with the battle claim of from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and fighting anti-Semitism and dealing with anti-Semitism and dealing with that narrative around America, around the world, fighting BDS. Some thoughts, please.
You hit all the key words.
It's all the stuff,
so
right?
First, I want to thank the organizers for having me. What an honor it is to be here in a room with so many luminaries and experts that I follow and I admire and that I learn from. I want to start actually by reading from a petition that was filed in 1999 by the late, great Howard Grief and his colleagues. And the executive summary states the following. It was beyond belief those directing the affairs of the government of Israel one day lost their senses. They decided voluntarily, secretly, and anti-democratically to make an agreement with an illegal criminal organization representing a fictitious nation non-existent in anyone's imagination prior to this century. They ceded parts of the heritage of every Jew living in the land of Israel, as well as those outside the country who identify with the aims of Zionism. Now, Howard Grief and his colleagues submitted this petition to annul the interim agreement in 1999 before the Israeli Supreme Court. And they asked the judges for a ruling on the legality of what was done in their name by the government. And his petition so artfully presented no less than 14 breaches of legislative enactments and principles of law, which were found in the interim agreement. The Supreme Court refused to recognize the legitimacy of his petition, declared that this was not a legal petition, rather it was a political position, and dismissed it outright. 16 years later, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas went before the UN General Assembly, and he declared that Oslo was dead, and he was going to use, quote, all peaceful and legal means to end the peace process immediately. What was his first step? Incitement to genocide. He declared the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the Temple Mount, is ours. Those Jews have no right to desecrate them with their filthy feet. We welcome every drop of blood spilled in Jerusalem. This is pure blood, clean blood, blood on its way to Allah. There are a lot of experts in this room, but you don't have to be an expert to understand the obvious, that Oslo is indeed dead. It was dead from the day it was born. The only people who are deluding themselves, who consider themselves bound by the terms of this failed agreement, is us. Our enemies pretend to care about Oslo, but they simply use it as a means to handcuff us as we deal with existential threats like fighting terrorism. And if you've attended any of the amazing classes by Professor Eugene Kontorovich, you would learn a very basic principle in international law, in treaty law, which is that when one side breaches the terms of a treaty willfully, repeatedly, those breaches can declare the treaty invalid if the other party claims that it is invalid and nullifies the treaty. Why we have not done that is beyond me. Why we continue to exist in a farce made of our own creation is beyond me. We are responsible for the declassification of terrorist groups. We are responsible for turning murderers into statesmen. We are responsible for creating a situation where billions and billions of dollars are going to fund terrorism that has killed thousands of innocent Jews, men, women, and children. And you have to ask yourself, are we better now than we were before Oslo? Before 1993, the PLO committed terror bombings, took hostages, massacred Jewish athletes, sent their own children into the fields as child soldiers and human shields. The day after we signed Oslo, the incitement to genocide just increased. The death toll rose, but what happened? They got more money. They got more legitimacy. And that legitimacy is what has aided the efforts to spread anti-Semitism around the world. The goal has never been to construct a Palestinian state. The goal has always been the destruction of a Jewish state. And recently, the incitement has reached unprecedented levels, where now we are witnessing something what many people have called to be the child intifada, where hundreds and hundreds of innocent Muslim children are being taught on a daily basis, funded by US taxpayer dollars, funded by Israeli dollars too, allowed. We allow the PATV to indoctrinate children, to teach them to kill themselves in the name of jihad. We allow UNRWA schools to hire Hamas, hire teachers off the Hamas payroll, invite Al-Qutla al-Islamiyya into the schools, and recruit the children for suicide, homicide attacks. And this, in my opinion, is the greatest crime that we have aided and abetted, which is the premeditated murder of innocent Muslim children, the destruction of the future of both our society and theirs. And despite this ongoing violence, Oslo is protecting these terrorists. They're funded, they're given legitimacy, and we are now guaranteed a never-ending conflict. And to the point that you want me to address, and I'll do so as briefly as possible. In the diaspora, this has enabled anti-Semitism. It has fed into the narrative of anti-Semitism. It has allowed Jew haters to argue that Israel is not legitimate when it acts to protect its citizens. It has allowed people to call terrorists freedom fighters for the state of Palestine. And it's created a huge problem in the diaspora, where instead of advocating for Jewish civil rights, instead of launching a Jewish civil rights movement, we are obsessed with fighting anti-Semitism by pro-Israel advocacy, as we like to call it. It's not Jewish advocacy, it's pro-Israel advocacy. And Jewish students are taught if they want to be advocates, they have to be pro-Israel. They have to memorize a 15-page pamphlet on why Israel is an apartheid state, adopt legal arguments. They have to go to law school, they have to get a law degree, they have to go on the defense, they have to enter into the arena with a shield, not a sword. They have to use terminologies that were invented by our enemies and argue in a paradigm that's a losing one. Two-state solution. Creating another Islamist state in a sea of failed Islamist dictatorships is not a solution to anything. We have to defend against the occupation of so-called Palestinian land. We have to argue that Jews are indigenous to Judea. If Jews don't come from Judea, I don't know where we come from. So we have to make a hard choice in the diaspora. And that's why we launched, for example, the End Jew Hatred movement, which, to my surprise, is the first ever Jewish civil rights movement in American history. Jews being the oldest, most persecuted minority community in human history, still have not received parity. And we live in the age of minority rights movements. It's not the same to be black as it was 10 years ago. It's not the same to be a woman in the workforce as it was 5 years ago. It's not the same to be gay as it was 2 years ago. And yet, why is it that it is still socially acceptable to engage in Jew hatred in the West? Because we have been completely obsessed with defending Israel under this paradigm that we created for ourselves. And we have hindered our ability to advocate for ourselves as a minority community deserved of equal protection and civil rights, regardless of what's happening in Israel. And what we do is we've been responding to anti-Jewish discrimination with pro-Israel advocacy, giving our detractors an affirmative defense to do what they're doing. So, as I write in my book, and I'll conclude with this, End Jew Hatred, a Manual for Mobilization, the time is now to shed these narratives and to empower Jewish communities in the diaspora to engage in grassroots mobilization and direct action through minority rights movements that ensure consequences for Jew haters. That is our #1 goal. Not pro-Israel advocacy, not to get people to love Israel, but to make sure that Jew hatred has political, legal, and other consequences. Thank you.
Amazing. And really, if we're talking about the idea of Jew hatred having consequences, that's really Nitzana. Nitzana just finished a 20-year battle against the Palestinian Authority. It started in October 2000. Almost 23 years ago. 2 Israeli soldiers lost their way and ended up in a police station in Ramallah. Rai Chech, the head of the police station there, would describe the way that he beat Yossi Nordich, Vadim Nordich with a Slav Keres, with I can't even think of the word in English. It's the thing that you use to release a tire, and a crowbar. Let's say it's a crowbar, and how Yossi really his soul left him with chilchel. How he was just losing it, slowly losing his soul. And he told that proudly to his investigators. In court, he stood there with a smile on his face, proud of what he'd done in the name of the Palestinian Authority as a policeman who was meant to be looking after Jewish rights and not taking their lives. Nitzana, tell us a little bit about that whole movement to really make Jewish lives matter via money, because there doesn't seem to be any other way that we're managing to do that.
Thank you for inviting me for this very important conference, unique conference. I don't think there are many conferences like this in Israel 30 years after Oslo. We begin with a fight against the Palestinian Authority, or the fight against the terror financing back then, the beginning of the Intifada. In the year of 2000, we were going to experience what we experienced in the first Intifada, buses getting blown up, suicide bombing, drive-by shooting, and we said that this time we are going to fight back. That this time we will go after those who are accountable, who are those who are responsible, and will make them pay, because the Palestinian perhaps can kill us, but they have to pay a very high price. We are waiting for the case to come, and it came very, very sooner than expected. It was the lynching case of the 2 soldiers in Ramallah, and we filed a lawsuit against the Palestinian Authority because it was done by Palestinian policemen in the Palestinian police station in the territory of the Palestinian Authority, clear and cut case against the Palestinian Authority. And we continued filing cases over the 2 years, both in Israel and the United States. And then there was a unit in the Mossad called Harpoon, a secret unit that fought terror financing, that approached us to collaborate with them. It happened after the Dolphinarium discotheque in Tel Aviv, where 28 young people got killed, and the Moment Cafe in Jerusalem, 18 young people get killed, and the Park Hotel in Netanya, 30 guests over Passover set are getting killed, and they asked, perhaps we can work together, accelerate the lawsuits against 2 things. One, against those who drives the Intifada, who directs the Intifada, who push and indoctrinate and call people to go and kill Jews, the Palestinian Authority. And the second, against those who physically transfer the money from Europe, from United States, from Syria, from Jordan, into the hands of the Palestinian organizations in Judea and Samaria and Gaza? The banks. We couldn't do it as private lawyers anymore. We established Shurat Hadin, a non-for-profit organization, to take this battle against the terror organizations and their financial patrons to court. And in 2004, we decided that we will not just sue the Palestinian Authority in Israel, but also in the United States. Because although Israel blamed the Palestinian Authority, and although they knew and they told everyone that Yasser Arafat is the one that sends the terrorists to kill Jews, nobody believed them. The State Department ignored it. Europe did not take it into consideration when they poured millions and millions of dollars into the hands of the Palestinian organizations. So we filed a lawsuit in the United States on behalf of 10 families that lost their loved ones in the terror attacks during the Intifada, American citizens, the Sbarro pizza place in Jerusalem, and the 443 roads shooting attacks, and the French Hill Junction suicide bombing. We sued the Palestinian Authority in the court in New York, and after 11 years of litigation, the Palestinian Authority hired lawyers, came to court, filed motion to dismiss. We went to discovery in the positions, 11 years, the trial opened before jury in New York, lasted 50 days. The Palestinian Authority had a defense. They said, indeed, these all terror attacks were done by their employees, by their policemen, by their security men, but they were rogue employees. They did the attacks after work hours. It wasn't their policy to kill Israelis. They were against killing Jews. But when the trial opened, they found it hard to explain to the jury if they were rogue employees, how do you keep paying their salary until today? These terrorists that were tried in Israeli court and put in jail in the Israeli prison, serving their sentence, receive a salary from you month after month. You call streets and town squares on the name of the suicide bombers. You pay stipends to the families of the suicide bombers. This is not how you deal with rogue employees. This is not where your policy is against killing Jews. So there was no surprise that when the jury came back from deliberation, they gave us a judgment against the Palestinian Authority for $655 million. In Israel, we had a different story. In Israel, we filed a case on behalf of the lynching soldiers. We filed more lawsuits on similar terror attacks that we sued in the United States. French Hill Junction suicide bombing. The Cohen family kids that lost their legs in a bus bombing attack, missile attacks, everything. This time not on behalf of 10 families, but on behalf of 25 families. And the trial did not last 11 years, it lasted 23 years. But when we finally received the judgment, it was for 130 million shekels. It's equal to 25 families. 25 families, how much is 130 million shekels in dollars? Less than $40 million. Less than $40 million on behalf of 25 families versus the judgment we received in the States, $655 million on behalf of 10 families. And if that was not enough, the way to collect the judgment against the Palestinian Authority is to put a lien on the tax money that Israel collects for the Palestinian Authority on a monthly basis. This money belongs to the Palestinian Authority, and Israel, by law, is allowed to make an offset and deduct final debts of the Palestinian Authority from this money. If the Palestinian Authority owes money to the electric company, Israel can deduct it. Owes money to Hadassah Hospital, Israel can deduct it. We received a judgment against the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority litigated this case for 23 years. They had a chance to defend themselves, and they defended it vigorously, and they lost the case. It's a final judgment. The Israeli government should pay it from the tax money. This is what we did. We have started a lien on the Palestinian Authority tax money, but Israel refused to pay. It was in the previous government. I met Benny Gantz one day on a flight to New York, and I was a defense minister, and I tell Benny, you have to pay this judgment. By law, you have to pay this judgment. The terror victims went to this fight and fought for 23 years because you sent them. You asked them to file lawsuits against the villain, against the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority defended themselves and lost. And you have now to do your job and pay compensations for the victims. Instead of you going and pay directly, the victims went through the whole process, had a trial for 23 years, won a judgment. Now we refuse to pay it? And Benny Gantz answered and said, it's complicated. It's hard. There is a pressure by the State Department to keep the Palestinian Authority and not to bring it into bankruptcy. And I said, 130 million shekels will not bankrupt the Palestinian Authority. When they pay 1 billion shekels to their prisoners who are sitting in the Israeli jail, 130 million shekels will not bankrupt them. It's moral, it's just to pay the judgment. Fortunately, there was a new government formed shortly after, and Minister Smotrich, the finance minister, immediately, the first day he stepped into office, paid the judgment from the tax money. Just to finalize, it's not up to the court to give compensations. The court has their personal views, and they think that 3 million shekels for a victim is enough. We don't think so. United States does not think so. The world cannot think so. So we are in a process of passing legislation in the Knesset to create a minimum compensations of 10 million shekels per victim, per plaintiff in terror victim litigations. The next speaker after this panel or later on will be Yuli Edelstein. We'll pressure him to pass this legislation, because if Israel wants to fight back against those who are killing its citizens, it's only through the pocket. Thank you very much.
So that I really think is the good news. We're about to hear from Yuli Edelstein in the Knesset hearing discussing the legislation that just before the recess passed its first hearing with really a substantial majority. Yuli is on the record saying that this is probably one of the most justified laws that exists. You stop terrorism by imposing heavy fines, by allowing the victims to claim their rights. A very simple principle of compensate the victims and not the terrorists. And that's what I think we would hope to hear from Yuli Edelstein this afternoon. Thank you all very much. Really admiration for all of your work. Thank you for coming and for sharing with us some of your thoughts.